an athlete will only be able to perform as well as their recovery will allow. In stress physiology, there's a term called allostatic load. And what that means is allostatic load is the total amount of stress that the body is under at any given time. So if you're working with a lot of student athletes, high school student athletes, collegiate student athletes, they have a lot of other obligations as far as classes and exams go than are often considered by sports coaches and or the strength and conditioning staff. And so if you have, student athletes that maybe they have had a week of exams, that needs to be considered when you're putting a training program together, or at least you reduce the volume during periods when you know that they have, finals coming up or midterms, or something like that. And so what ends up happening is that it ultimately leads to too much stress. It leads to overstress. And if that's not factored in, then that can lead to a decrement in performance because you're not allowing the body enough time to recover between workouts. And it doesn't, like I said, have to be workouts that is inducing the stress response. It could be just a strenuous time of exams, things like that. So a strength coach, any strength coach can follow a program as it's written. But what is harder to do is understand what the training objective is and then modify a program in such a way where you're still working towards what the training objective is, but you're not burying the athlete. And so we see this a lot with high school programs and see it a lot with collegiate programs. And so ultimately, essentially what overstressed is, or being in an overtrained state, is it is an imbalance between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system dominance. And so if you have athletes that are in a constantly stimulated state, that stimulation will eat into their ability to recover. For example, we know that, for example, endurance athletes many times, they have higher resting cortisol levels, if you will, than strength and power athletes. And it just is due to the nature of their sport. And so anytime the sympathetic nervous system is activated, it's also known the fight or flight response. And so it will the body will mobilize the physiological systems that are necessary to either meet the threat or escape the threat. And so if you're on a constantly stimulated state like that, it will actually start to downregulate hydrochloric acid production in the stomach. It can start to downregulate testosterone as well, and other androgenic hormones. And so ultimately what we're looking at is, we want enough stimulation to elicit some sort of a stress response, but then we also want to be able to back off a bit and let the body recover. For example, I had an intern tell me once that a strength coach that he was interning under in organized athletics at a university said that the German volume training, so the 10 by 10 method, 10 sets of 10 reps method, was a complete. It was bullshit, is what he said. And the reason that he cited was because he used it with an athlete that was, so he put this athlete through the 10 by 10 program, and it made her so sore that she couldn't work out again on their next scheduled training program. And so to me, what that says is that was a misapplication of a training method. And ultimately what it was is that it was too much stimulation for where she was at, and she was unable to recover between workouts. And so that doesn't make that method a bad method. It just makes it's just a poor application, of that method. And so kind of to touch on that note as well, if we're talking about an elite level athlete now, the program that took you from, we'll say, amateur status to pro status is not going to be the same program that sustains you as a pro. There's a saying in powerlifting, for example, that the program that took your bench press, we'll say, from 300 pounds to 400 pounds is not going to be the same program that takes your bench press from 400 pounds to 500 pounds, okay? And so it's all about trying to find, if we're talking about elite level athletes, we're really looking at the minimal effective dose. Because the programs that they were using that at an amateur level, before they make it pro, they're typically younger and their bodies are going to be more resilient, right? But if you continue down that path where it is where you spend more time in the sympathetic dominance than you do in parasympathetic dominance, then it's going to start to impair your ability, to recover. And so while overtraining many times is asymptomatic, there are things to look for that will give you an indication if an athlete is overstressed or maybe getting to a point where they're overtrained. For example, sleep disturbances, loss of appetite. You start to see decrements in their performance if you have performance metrics that you check in with regularly. And so no matter how hard the athlete tries, they just don't have it in the tank to put out, and then they can't meet their numbers, and then they start to get concerned because they can't meet the standard that they themselves have set. And so, many times, especially with endurance athletes, what you'll find is they feel then at that point that they need either more time practicing their sport. If they're a runner, they typically will pick up the mileage. If they're a cyclist, same thing, they'll pick up the mileage. And as a matter of fact, what they should be doing is the exact opposite, is to take time off the bike, reduce mileage, and let the body kind of get back into a parasympathetic state during recovery periods. And so in my experience working with athletes, one of the first things that typically shows up is sleep disturbances. And so if you're not able to get 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night, then over time your chances of injury actually increase. And so it's completely counterintuitive, but at the same time, if you have a good understanding of how stress physiology works, it puts you in a better position to identify those things before they become an issue. And so at the end of the day, it is perfectly acceptable to reduce the volume if somebody is not recovering between workouts like they should. So like I said, any strength coach can follow a program as it's written, but it's a little bit harder to know when to back off to get ultimately where you want to be. And so to kind of in closing here, monitor the athletes and their performance. Ask them how they're feeling, because many times an athlete will tell you what you want to know without actually even saying it. And so if the longer that you're a strength coach, the longer that you work on how to interpret body language and things like that, you will frequently know. Many times, to be honest with you, I will position myself at the front desk here at my gym, and I can see out. So we have tinted windows, and so I can see someone coming in, but they can't necessarily see me looking out. And so I'll position myself at the front desk, and I'll watch how they walk into the gym, because their body language frequently can tell you as much can tell you what you need to know. And then from there, I'll maybe ask them some questions to get a better read on how they're feeling. And if they're feeling a little bit lethargic, if they're not feeling it, and you can tell that they're not feeling it, I back the volume down and for that workout. And then we just proceed from there. So for example, if a program that we're on says 5 sets of 5 in a front squat, well, maybe that day we do 3 sets of 5. And so we're still getting some stimulus, but we're not overstimulating them, and so they're going to be able to they'll be in a position to recover more quickly between workouts. So at the end of the day, know your athletes, and know when to back the volume down. I used to refer to it as jokingly the Kenny Rogers method, after the country music stars got the song called "The Gambler." You got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. And so, that's something that I'd practiced for a long time. And it wasn't until I actually read an article on T Nation, I believe it was by Christian Thibodeau, where he talks about auto-regulation. And all that means is that you're going to have days where you feel really, really good. So you want to take advantage of those days. By comparison, you're going to have days where you don't feel so good. And it is perfectly acceptable to back the volume down on those days where you're not feeling so good. So as the saying goes, perfection doesn't exist and is not necessary for success, but consistency is. And so as long as someone is staying consistent with their training, they're usually going to be on the path to get to where they want to go. But if they are constantly worn out, then it's going to be a much steeper climb. So know when to hold them and know when to fold them. Thanks, guys.